So this is a reflection on one of, I think, Martin Luther King's greatest messages, why Jesus called a man a fool. It's one of my favorites for a couple reasons. Number one, it's a story. There's a story at the end of it that he tells about a very difficult night in his life when he was threatened. And in that moment, he realized how much he needed God. That will make more sense when we get to point 3 of his sermon. But it's a story that I go into some length in reading and talking about in another video. So I encourage you to go back and look at a video that I call Martin Luther King's Great Discovery. I linked it in the comment section. You cannot understand Martin Luther King Jr. without understanding this amazing story. But another reason why I like this sermon is because it's a quote, that's something that he says in the beginning of the sermon that's really unrelated to the message. King preached this sermon in August of 1967 in Chicago, Mount Pisgah Missionary Baptist Church. And this was the height of his political influence. Many think he could have easily run for office, at least senator, maybe even president, around the time that he preached this in 67. But this is what he says. He says this in the beginning of his sermon. Martin Luther King, before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first calling and still remains my greatest commitment. Actually, all that I do in civil rights, I do because I consider it part of my ministry. And he goes on to say he could run, but he won't run for office because he is just a minister. He's just a preacher of the gospel. As a preacher of the gospel myself, I just kind of have to find kinship with that, appreciate that. I like that. But then he goes into the meat of the sermon, which is a consideration or a reflection on a parable of Jesus from the Gospel of Luke, the parable of the rich fool. And Martin Luther King is going to give us 3 reasons why he thinks Jesus called this man a fool. But before we look at what King said, let's look at what Jesus said. Gospel of Luke chapter 12, beginning with verse 16, the parable of the rich fool. Jesus told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store all my crops. And then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I will build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of things laid up for many years. So take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Verse 20, but God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. So again, King is going to share 3 reasons why Jesus called this man a fool. But he starts by saying, here's 2 reasons why not. In other words, don't think this is why Jesus called him a fool, because it's not true. Number 1, Jesus didn't call him a fool because he made his money in dishonest fashion. As a matter of fact, there's nowhere in the parable that gives us kind of an indication that he was, making money illegally, unjustly, untowardly. As a matter of fact, you look at the parable and it looks like he was a hard worker. It looks like he was industrious. It looks like he had a pretty good business or farm for himself. So it's not because he was acting in an illegal or immoral way. The second thing Jesus says is that he didn't call him a fool simply because he was rich. King will go on to say that there's nowhere in the Bible that simply condemns rich as being bad simply because you're rich. He points out that Abraham was rich. There's nothing wrong with being rich. In essence, it's how you use it. And that is where we point to the parable and what King says were some of the reasons why Jesus called this man a fool. So he offers 3 reasons. The first reason why, and you got to listen, he says because the man allowed the means by which he lived to outdistance the ends for which he lived. Let me say that again. Jesus called this man a fool because he allowed the means by which he lived to outdistance the ends for which he lived. And in my Jim Souser translation of that, he put stuff, the means by which he lived, over faith and relationships and morality, which is the ends for which he lived. In other words, stuff above principles, stuff above values. A quote here from King says, he was a fool because he maximized the minimum and minimized the maximum. The man was a fool because he allowed technology to outdistance his theology. Let me say that again, because now we're in like 2021, and he said this in 67. The man was a fool because he allowed his technology to outdistance his theology. I don't know if King had any idea the truth he was leading us into when he said that. And then he gives this illustration to kind of make it clear. He says there was a guy who's from Atlanta. Why he says he was from Atlanta, I don't know. But he says there was a guy from Atlanta, and his wife was driving his Cadillac on the interstate, and she gets in an accident. The cops call and say, hey, your wife's been in an accident. And the guy's first question was, how's my Cadillac? And King says, this is the essence of what I'm talking about here. You know, he wasn't a fool because he had a Cadillac. He was a fool because he put his Cadillac ahead of what was more important. And King was saying in this parable, this man was a fool because he was putting his stuff in all of his barns ahead of everything else. And he points back to Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. I think a very appropriate verse when we think about this. Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and then all these things will be added unto you. So the first reason why is because he allowed the means by which he lived his stuff to outdistance the ends for which he lived, his relationships, his morality, his values, etc. The second thing, King says Jesus called this man a fool because he failed to realize his dependence on others. He lived with himself in the mirror. Basically what King was saying. And he points out to the fact, and I love this little fact, he says that in this parable, the man, the fool, utters about 60 words. And King notes that like 15 of them, about a quarter of the words he speaks are like I and me and mine and you know, things are all about him. Like everything he did was for himself. And every thought he had was, how is this going to affect me? And King, and I quote, says, you know, no matter where you are today, somebody helped you get there. And he highlights the importance of community, that the person who forgets the critical fact that they are part of a community in a larger group, and the things they have, the decisions that they make affect others, if they forget that, they are destined to become a fool like the guy in the parable who had all this extra grain and all this extra stuff, and his only thought was, what can I do for me? And so Jesus said he was a fool because he failed to realize his dependence on others. He was also a fool, to go back to number one, because he allowed the means by which he lived to outdistance the ends for which he lived. And now the third one, and I think it's the most important one, because he failed to realize his dependence on God. And this is a major point if you look at Martin Luther King's sermons. This point makes its way into a lot of stuff that he said. This man was a fool because he failed to realize his dependence on God. It's a major point in another sermon that I studied called The 3 Dimensions of a Complete Life. And he calls it man-centered foolishness, living as God didn't exist. And he makes this promise to the congregation. I want to read this quote. It's interesting. He says, God is still around, and one day you are going to need him. This is King. The problems of life will begin to overwhelm you. Disappointments will begin to beat upon the door of your life like a tidal wave. And if you don't have a deep and patient faith, you aren't going to be able to make it. And I know this from my own experience. The first 25 years of my life were comfortable years. Very happy years, and I didn't have to worry about anything. I have a tremendous mother and father, and they went out of the way to provide everything for their children. Basic necessities. I went to the right school. I never had to drop out for work or anything. And you know, I was about to conclude at 25 years old that life had been wrapped up for me in a Christmas package. And then he goes on to tell this horrible, tragic, scary story. Something that happened to him around midnight as he was emerging as a civil rights leader. And it made him realize how much he needed God. No matter how together he thought he was, and no matter how on top of life he thought he had it, this incident made him realize, I need God. And in essence, he's saying, you're all going to run into that someday, just like this man did when Jesus said, you fool, because today you're going to die. Today you're going to meet God. Today you're going to meet a hill you can't climb, or a wall you cannot scale. And again, this story, I'm not going to go into it now because it's kind of long, but I explore it in the video called Martin Luther King's Great Discovery, and you need to listen to that. Watch that video. But King ends this way. He says, don't be a fool. And I love he's pulling no punches here. He's hitting hard. He says, don't be a fool and recognize your dependence on God. As the days become dark and the nights become dreary, realize there's a God who rules above. And then he ends the sermon saying, I'm not worried about tomorrow. I get weary every now and then. The future looks different and dim, but I'm not worried, ultimately because I have faith in God. So this is his reflection on this parable, Jesus' parable, the parable of the rich fool. And King says there are 3 reasons why Jesus called this man a fool. Number 1, because he allowed the means by which he lived to outdistance the ends for which he lived. Number 2, because he failed to realize his dependence on others. And number 3, because he failed to realize his dependence on God. We thank you, Lord, for this message. Martin Luther King, for a wonderful reflection on it. I thank you for listening. Walk in peace. Have the best day possible and stay awesome. Take care.